So welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing Columbus, the Four Voyages with award-winning author Laurence Bergreen. I'm Mary Fuller, professor of literature at MIT, and I'll be your moderator. Christopher Columbus never set foot on the mainland of North America, but generations of school children have been taught that Columbus discovered America. This is just one of the paradoxes attending this explorer's career, both in his own time and in his historical afterlife. Our speaker, Laurence Bergreen, has just completed the first major biography of Columbus in more than 60 years. His book, Columbus, the Four Voyages, places this 15th century explorer's achievements into the larger context of the age of discovery and exploration, both in terms of the rewards of exploration and its tragic costs. How significant was Columbus in his own time? What accounts for his lasting fame? How do we understand his ambiguous legacy? Founding the town of Santo Domingo, provoking 50,000 natives to choose death over life under his government. What role does he play in America's founding mythology? A graduate of Harvard University, Laurence Bergreen is the author of 8 acclaimed works of nonfiction, including Marco Polo, From Venice to Xanadu, and Over the Edge of the World, Magellan's terrifying circumnavigation of the globe. He has also written biographies of James Agee, Louis Armstrong, Al Capone, and Irving Berlin, each considered definitive. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Larry Bergreen.
Thank you, Professor Fuller, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming tonight. It's great to see you. I'd like to begin with a little confession. The last time I was here, somebody's cell phone went off, and it got louder and louder and louder, and it was amplified by this microphone, and I finally became very annoyed and stopped talking and insisted that whoever owned this cell phone turn it off immediately. It was me. It was a kind of Belfast. So just want to make sure. It's one of perhaps my most embarrassing public speaking moment. Anyway, Columbus, the Four Voyages was a very daunting subject. It was looming out there for years after the Marco Polo book and Over the Edge of the World, going back almost 10 years. If some of you are familiar with those books, then you're aware of the connection among these 3 people, Marco Polo having inspired Columbus and Magellan and many others to go in search of India and China, which they never did find, at least not the way they were going. They were trying to find a shortcut, a water route to Marco Polo's China in order to bring back the riches of Asia more quickly than Marco Polo could. In his day, it took 7 or 8 years to get there being somewhere in China, Beijing, for example, and 7 or 8 years or longer to get back. They were hoping to do this much more quickly. The efforts of Columbus and Magellan and others were hampered by the faulty understanding of the size and shape of the world. As you probably know, the ancients, the Greeks and Romans, had a relatively good idea of the size, or accurate idea of the size of the Earth. They had managed to divine this through calculations with a stick and the sun, and figured out that the circumference was about 25,000 miles. They weren't sure what was there, but they got that part right. But that was lost knowledge. That was slowly being recovered during the Renaissance, but it had not been recovered during Columbus's era. So he, along with other navigators of his day, conceived of the world without the largest body of water on the planet, the Pacific Ocean, being part of it. Therefore, whatever they decided to do seemed rather easy because the Pacific Ocean was subtracted from their calculations and their maps. They were using maps that were wildly inaccurate, that were combinations of mythology, projections, and then pilots' legends that were informally passed along from one pilot to another. It's hard to know exactly what they were, but they heard stories about lands beyond the ocean sea that lay to the west, and the ocean sea being their name for the Atlantic. And Columbus was one more person who caught this particular fever, and in his case, he was particularly taken with the idea of self-aggrandizement. Columbus was nothing if not a self-aggrandizer, and also a religious conviction which became stronger and stronger during his life and impelled him on by the time he got to his third voyage, he thought he discovered the entrance to heaven just north of the Paria Peninsula on the coast of Venezuela. He was much more of a religious figure than we would normally think. He became a lay Franciscan friar. The Franciscans have a lay order which he joined. When he was on land, he often wore his monk's habit, a brown habit. He was buried in it, and when other sailors and captains were on shore and went back to their families or to taverns or to brothels, Columbus, without fail, went to monasteries to retreat and reflect and to rest and to keep the company of monks and scholars. So he was very different, really cut from a different cloth from many of the swashbuckling explorers of the era. He was subject to hallucinations. He thought he heard the voice of God, again, on the later voyages, and we have some idea of what he thought God was saying because he wrote down God's words. We don't really know what language God spoke to him in, if it was Italian, he was from Genoa, or Spanish, or some other language. But we get a sense that he felt he was being divinely, if not inspired, then motivated. So he was a figure who felt he was often obeying higher principles, higher even than Ferdinand and Isabella, the sovereigns of Spain, who sent him. Because my time for talking is so short, I won't actually try and walk through the Four Voyages in the few minutes that I have to talk before we open the floor to comments or questions, but I'll try to get into that later. But I would like to explain a little bit about Columbus historiography and why the time seemed right for another book about Columbus. When I began the book about Marco Polo, there was actually very little about Marco Polo written in English. There were some French books by French scholars who were under the sway of Orientalism. But of course, Columbus has been the subject of a vast historiography in English, in Spanish, in French, and in Italian. Many countries have claimed him. There's been a big dispute about his origins that has gone back for centuries, but it's really beyond dispute that he is from Genoa. It's been heavily documented. Hundreds and hundreds of documents show the activities of him and his family. There are many counterfactual traditions, or several, that insist that Columbus actually came from somewhere else. The most recent popped up in the Daily Mail in London about a year or two ago. I have a copy of it. A team of researchers claimed that he was actually Polish, and that they were going to prove this with DNA testing, and that he was the illegitimate son of King Stanislaus. And I looked at the date of the Daily Mail. I thought this must be April 1st, and this was a wry joke, but it was not. And the results of the DNA tests, well, we're still waiting to hear them. But other traditions place him in Spain. When I was doing research in Brazil in a Portuguese language library, the Royal Library of Literature in Rio de Janeiro, I had a stack of books, about 12 of them in all, describing Columbus's Portuguese origins. And he was not from Portugal. His first wife was Portuguese, and that was an important relationship, as you know if you're familiar with my book or other books about Columbus. It gave him some entree into Portuguese society, which was his first attempt to find backing for a voyage, and 8 frustrating years later he was unable to. Other traditions have placed him in other countries, but we just keep coming back to Genoa, which had a very vital commercial maritime tradition, and where his father was a well-known local politician, and where he was educated in a maritime guild, given an education in Latin and French, and of course navigation, and grew up with the sea and to become exactly what he became, which is a mariner. We know that he made some early voyages before he attempted these very ambitious ones. Come on, take a seat. And his early voyages took him to England, to Ireland, to Iceland. We don't know much about them, and Certainly it would be fascinating to hear more about them. We know that he traveled from one end of the Mediterranean to the other, got as far as the island of Chios in Greece, where Genoa maintained a colony, and he did some trading. So at the time he came to seek the backing of first King João of Portugal and then Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, he'd had experience on a local level, if you will, or European level, some experience or precedent for doing what he was going to attempt to do now. You have to just step back to admire the sheer courage and audacity of the man, because he was proposing to do something which nobody had come back from successfully. There was no other navigator that we know of who left any port in Europe to sail across the ocean sea in search of China or anywhere else and made it back. There were some stories about people who were seen or washed up or disappeared in a storm, but Columbus was the first to do that, and he didn't just do it once, he did it 4 times and made it possible for many others to do it as well. And within a few years, some other sailors and navigators, such as Amerigo Vespucci and others who had sailed with him, were doing it as well or better than he. And the secret is the trade winds, which he came across on his first crossing of the Atlantic, and took him across in only 3.5 weeks, to his surprise, as well as that of his crew, and with relatively calm seas and a swift crossing, and he felt he had reached China. One of the important things about Columbus's nature to keep in mind, in addition to his devout side or his religiosity or his deep faith, was his stubbornness. As facts grew over the 12 years of these voyages, of these 4 voyages, that he was not in China, that he had arrived in a new place that was not known to Europe, the more obstinate he became that he was actually in China, and he wouldn't yield to that. I think a case in point concerned the island of Cuba, which he visited various times, several times on his explored intensively, and spoke to many of the people who lived there. They were generally known as the Taino. He called them Indians because he thought he was in India, as we've all learned. But the Taino, and I'll sometimes call them the Taino, and sometimes I'll call them the Indians, but they mean the same people. And they told him that this big land mass of Cuba was an island, and that if he sailed far enough west, he would come to the western edge of it. But he refused to do that. He didn't want to know that. And he even made the men and even the cabin boys on that voyage sign an oath that Cuba was in fact part of the Asian mainland. Even when some of them knew better. For example, the cruise map maker, Juan de la Cosa, recognized that Cuba was an island, and soon after, when he got back to Spain, drew a map showing that Cuba was indeed an island. That map is now on display at the Hispanic Society in Upper Manhattan in New York City. But Columbus could be quite ruthless and quite narrow-minded. He's often portrayed as being the first modern explorer, a man of the Renaissance, a rational thinker. This was a secret or part of the secret of his success, but really that's not the case. As I'm trying to suggest, he had a very rigid or medieval mindset. He could often be irrational, and oddly enough, this is what makes him so memorable, as well as fascinating and frustrating and compelling. For example, Columbus had a brother named Bartholomew, who was smarter, who was well regarded. Bartholomew was a map maker. He had gone on some of the early voyages with Columbus to Iceland and other places, and he went on some of the later voyages with his brother Columbus to the New World. And he was well regarded by other sailors. Some of them wrote about him and called him the leader. That was his nickname. And they said his sailing skills were as good or better than Columbus's. We know that Columbus, for all his irrationality, was a superb sailor. and knew how to read tides and winds and avoid reefs, across the Atlantic 8 times with little or no loss of life, which is an astonishing feat when you think about it. And yet we don't remember Bartholomew at all, because he was rational. He was reasonable. He was responsible. And he was down to earth. He didn't have visions about finding the New World. He didn't pretend that Cuba was part of the New World. He didn't think that if he sailed north, he would reach the Malaysian peninsula the way Columbus did. So what gave Columbus his memorable qualities were often these irrational beliefs. We now see them as being starkly irrational, that drove him on. One more point before I throw the floor open to questions and comments. We remember Columbus today as a genocidal monster, and it's no longer the Columbus of days of yore as a heroic conqueror, but he was always very unpopular, even in his lifetime. Even Ferdinand and Isabella considered him to be too cruel and to be too inhuman in his treatment of the Taino, of the Indians. In their instructions to him on the first voyage, they specifically wrote that he should treat the people that he found in the New World well, or in the lands that he discovered well, and convert them to Christianity. That was his purpose, as well as finding gold to enrich the Spanish Empire. But Columbus was from Genoa, and in Genoa, slavery was a long-established tradition. There were slaves from Eastern Europe. Any household who could have one, could afford one, had one. And when Columbus looked at the Indians, or the Taino in the New World, on the one hand, he was very impressed by their appearance, by the way they lived, by their skill, but at the same time, he couldn't help but think what great slaves they would make. And he even sent a ship filled with them back to Ferdinand and Isabella as a gift, in the way that he would send a ship back with gold or spices or something else. And they didn't want these people as slaves. They were not interested in them as slaves. They had just finished the Spanish Inquisition, after all, which was a long, painful process. They had driven outsiders from the Iberian Peninsula or forcibly converted them to Christianity, and the last thing they wanted was a arrival of new and unknown people. So they sent this ship back to the New World, much to Columbus's dismay. So he was following his own precepts, which were quite different from Ferdinand and Isabella. One last thing. In writing about these four voyages, I saw them as a unit, and the final three voyages are not an afterthought to the first one. They're really the logical culmination and conclusion. Each one is more complicated. Each one builds on the other. Generally, he sails further south on each one. And until we come to the fourth one, which is more or less of a Robinson Crusoe adventure, Columbus at this point had been demoted by his sovereigns, put together his own fleet, sailed off to the New World and tried to visit the Dominican Republic, the island of Hispaniola, and some of the other islands he had visited before, only to be sent away by his replacement, Nicolas de Ovando, which was a humiliating experience. He brought along his son Ferdinand, who was a teenager, and when Ferdinand got a little bit older, he became a historian and bibliophile. It was said that he owned the largest library in Spain. At that time, a nobleman often measured his wealth by the size of his library, because books were rare and precious objects. And Ferdinand wrote the first biography of Columbus, which was not entirely laudatory. But he also had the advantage of sailing with Columbus. So we get, if you will, a boy's eye view of Columbus on this fourth voyage, and his being shipwrecked on the island of Jamaica, which is where he sought refuge after being banished from Hispaniola. He was shipwrecked there for almost a year. On the beach, living in a ship which he had brought up on shore. By that time, he was nearly blind. His retinas had gotten scorched from staring at the sun. He was crippled by arthritis. It was very hard for him to get around, and thought he would never be rescued. He managed to hold off the Taino who lived there, the Indians, by consulting his navigational charts and predicting a lunar eclipse, which, as you know, is when the moon turns bright red or deep red. The last one occurred in June of this year, on June 11th, I believe, and they last about 90 or 100 minutes. And when he predicted this to the Indians, they were suddenly afraid of this frail old man who had landed in their midst, and decided he not only had accurately predicted this scary natural phenomenon, but had caused it and was some sort of a sorcerer. And so they gave him wide berth after that. Eventually he was rescued by the Spanish and made his way back to Spain, where he died, but already deeply unpopular, and he's been contested ever since. His legacy, the tragedies which he inadvertently inspired, and some of the accomplishments which he managed to attain, although we often wonder now to what end. So anyway, it's all in this book, and which draws heavily on primary sources, which are plentiful for Columbus and the era. And I think any comments or questions, he's pretty controversial, so I hope we'll hear a lot of different points of view.
All right, so you're joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Laurence Bergreen discussing his new book, Columbus, the Four Voyages. So I have a couple of questions just to start off, and one of them is sort of the 50,000 feet question, and the other one's a bit more nitty-gritty. You mentioned that the time seemed ripe for a new biography of Columbus, and I wonder what makes the time right?
Oh.
What made the time right? And how would you like to change the conversation or the big picture?
Oh, I see.
With this book?
That's a very good question. I had resisted doing it for so long because it is such a huge, daunting figure, and there was a lot in the English language. The biography that's considered the standard one is by Samuel Eliot Morison, which is Admiral of the Ocean Sea, which was published in 2 volumes in 1942. And often does draw on primary sources. Morrison's approach was to try and recreate Columbus's voyages. In other words, to sail to the same islands and go from harbor to harbor, from reef to reef, from shoal to shoal, and show and experience what Columbus did as a mariner from a technical point of view. Well, there were 2 problems, it seemed to me, with that approach. One was that Columbus spent most of his time on land grappling with the problem of administering the colony, especially on the island of Hispaniola. And he spent much more time on land, in fact, than he did on the ocean. So it seemed to me often that's where the story was happening, the struggles that he had with his own men, with the Taino, with his own health. And the other problem with that is that Morrison's calculations about 10 years later were shown not to be that accurate, and he was often 100 or 200 miles off. So when he showed or photographed a certain harbor or island and said, in effect, Columbus slept here or Columbus landed here, that wasn't the case. And so he was misguided, and that's because he didn't have the accurate lengths of units of measurement that Columbus was using. And we don't really have any artifacts that Columbus left or dropped or left behind where we could identify him for sure. For example, there's a long-standing dispute about where his first landfall is. One could write an entire book about that. And it's generally taken to be the island of Salvador, but there are 5 or 6 other islands that are serious competitors for that, and each one has a claim. So I felt that it was time to go back and take a look with more modern methods at the Columbus's track, and also recognize the limitations of trying to figure out exactly where he was.
Well, you said the word method, and that is actually a good introduction to my other question. I saw from the material at the end of the book, you've consulted a number of archives. You've obviously worked with a lot of primary sources, and there are so many sources.
Yes.
There's so many details in your book, which often need to be questioned and kind of triangulated against other evidence that, you say Columbus said, but clearly something else was the case. So there's a huge, massive detail that's been woven into a sort of cohesive narrative. What does your desk look like when you're writing this book, and how do you keep track?
My desk is okay because it's deliberately very small, but my files, actually, by the time I finished this book, I had, files all over my office on tabletops and on the floor. And even now, long after I finished this book, I still haven't managed to put them all away because there was so much material to try and collate and synthesize that it really was challenging. And part of it was, interesting because they didn't agree. If they all said the same thing, it would be easy. But they were often different because people had different agendas, or even the translations. Although virtually everything has been translated into English a number of times, even the translations are different. Some are expurgated and some aren't, and some highlight a nuance that others didn't. So simply trying to collate all this information was, for me, perhaps the biggest challenge of doing this. At some points, I thought I was writing a book that had a kind of Rashomon effect, because it seemed to me that each voyage had a somewhat different point of view. Columbus's point of view predominated in the first one, and his sons, for example, seemed to predominate or influence the last voyage.
How did you do the collating? Did you keep it all in your head? Did you have a note-taking system?
I kept a lot of notes about what sources fit with others, and I couldn't actually keep it all in my head. There was too much. Everybody has different kinds of cues to organize, but for me, having a filing system was helpful because I literally threw them on the floor and then moved them around in sections that somehow would seem to relate. And at least having Four Voyages meant that, at least, there were four discrete parts to it.
Mm-hmm. So it's the lateral filing on the floor. It's always good to know how people do these things. Okay, you're listening to Cambridge Forum with author Laurence Bergreen as we continue our discussion of Columbus, the Four Voyages, examining the role that Christopher Columbus played both in his own time, the Age of Discovery, and today in America's founding mythology. And at this point in the program, we'll take questions from the audience. So if you'd like to ask a question, please line up at the microphone and be succinct. The floor is open.
Good evening. My name is Bill Ackerley. I still have my childhood version of Columbus as a remarkable hero. I thought he was fabulous growing up. But now, the more I read about how brutal he was to the Indians, how he wasn't just making them slaves. He was cruel. He was horrible to the indigenous people. And I wondered, is that substantiated? You mentioned a little bit about taking these guys back to Spain or Portugal, but how about his treatment of the Indians?
I'm glad it was well documented in his lifetime. Probably the most, he didn't go to the New World or to China, as he thought, with the intention of becoming a genocidal monster. That was not his goal, to kill all the Indians at all. His goal was to convert them to Christianity and to look for gold. But perhaps the most egregious example of the unfortunate outcome of his voyages was the fact that the Indians, or Taino, with whom he at first had a cordial relationship, gradually became disenchanted with the Spanish because they didn't leave. There's an understanding among some historians that Columbus and his men were seen as the fulfillment of a prophecy, a messianic prophecy, that they were going to offer some sort of deliverance or new era to the Taino when they arrived, and things went on pretty much as they did before. But worse than that, Columbus in each voyage kept bringing more and more men. The men started mating with the Indian women, whom they found very, very attractive. and alluring, and stayed there and started families with them. To us, that seems kind of amusing or funny, but to many of the Taino men, this was a serious problem for two reasons. First of all, Columbus and his men were occupying their sacred grounds, their sacred lands, and they were in effect trespassing, and they felt they had no right to be there. The second reason was that, of course, they started having children with the Taino women, and they were as sensitive to their ancestry as anybody else was at that time, and they felt that their future was being robbed by doing that. It was somehow being changed or diverted for all time, and so they became very unhappy about this. Well, how did they react? They didn't actually become warlike. They were not warlike. They only had bamboo weapons, and they were not particularly military in their approach to things. They responded, their protest was to commit suicide. They swallowed poisonous leaves and other poisons, and they jumped off cliffs. There are cliffs on the island of Hispaniola. And they didn't just jump off or commit suicide by the hundreds or by the thousands, but by Columbus's estimate, and the estimate is of others, as many as 50,000 Indians committed suicide in protest against this occupation by the Spanish. Columbus was aware of this. He wrote about it in his journals and sort of shrugged his shoulders, didn't know what to make of it. And when word of this reached Spain and the powers that be back in Spain, they didn't know what to say, because after all, this was not a result that they expected. They thought that they would be received with open arms and begin trading the way Marco Polo did in China 200 years before. And this was something which was much, much more tragic. The Spanish didn't understand it at all. So Columbus's reputation was a very, controversial hardly begins to bleak, really from the get-go. He had many rivals at court, and when things began to go wrong in the New World, by the third voyage, he was brought back in chains. His time that he enjoyed the favor of the sovereigns was very short, just a few years. One of the few countries where he sort of maintained heroic stature for a long time was France, oddly enough. I think maybe because they didn't have any direct contact with him. And so the most heroic biographies of Columbus you find are 19th century accounts written in French. I hope that gives you some answer for your question.
You left us an opening. You said you hoped you could talk about all four voyages. So will you tell us about all four voyages?
Well, okay. I'll try and just summarize them, because there's no real short answer to that question. But conceptually, the first voyage, of course, was the one that proved that his notion that one could sail using the trade winds to another land safely and then sail back. The first voyage proved it, and it was the first time anybody had managed to do that. That was a legendary feat. The second voyage, which began within months of the first one, very quickly, was larger, much better funded, begun with a much greater sense of optimism and a triumphant note, was meant to increase the Spanish presence in the New World. When I say the New World, I really mean the island of Hispaniola, Cuba, and some of the islands around there. By 1502 or 1503, the city of Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic, which is the oldest European settlement in the New World, had been founded by Columbus and his men. It was a tiny, tiny place, made largely of wood at that point, very vulnerable to all weather and attack and all sorts of problems. And I feel that the second voyage was, in a sense, the apogee of his entire experiment. The third voyage, which occurred after a gap of about 2.5 years, took Columbus on a different tack, much further south. This is where he went down the coast of Panama and Nicaragua, all the way to Venezuela, This is where he thought he was sailing uphill, another one of his hallucinations, and saw the entrance to heaven. But he didn't go there. He didn't think it was part of his mission. This is a different Columbus. This is a Columbus in a colloquial way. He is beginning to lose his marbles and has really wandered off course quite literally, and has been more and more carried away with his visions of what he expected to find, went very far south. It's not clear exactly how far, but perhaps even to the northern coast of Brazil before heading back north. The fourth voyage, which is the one I mentioned a little bit earlier, that's the one he made with his son Ferdinand, which was the Robinson Crusoe-like adventure, which was unauthorized, and the one where he barely escaped with his life from the island of Jamaica. By the time of these last two voyages, which can kind of be seen as a unit, he had already been overtaken by his competition, Amerigo Vespucci, and a number of other sailors who had been with him on his earlier voyages, Alonso Ojeda and some others who were not as well known, got backing from Ferdinand and Isabella and went off on their own to try and outdo Columbus. Now, in doing so, Ferdinand and Isabella specifically violated their own agreement with Columbus, but on the other hand, they were the sovereigns and they could do whatever they wanted. So they quickly sent out these copycat missions. So within the space of only a few years, history passed Columbus by. It was only much later that his significance in the overall pattern of the European colonization, for better or for worse, of the New World came to be seen. In this country, Columbus's prominence wasn't really acknowledged until the late 19th century, when there was a significant influx of Italian Americans. The first time that he really loomed large in the American consciousness, beside a few names like the District of Columbia, which of course was highly significant, was the Columbus Exposition in Chicago in 1893. It was supposed to open in 1892 on the 400th anniversary, but it wasn't ready and opened up a year late. But even then, his place in the American kind of mythological pantheon is seen as some sort of a forefather in some way. Wasn't really secure until the 20th century, when FDR instituted Columbus Day in 1937. So we've only been celebrating an official, formal federal holiday of Columbus Day since then. Of course, the clamor about the real Columbus and his real voyages and his real adventure, were understood right from the start. And so there's always been a kind of a duality about him, and it's a few people I think have a greater distance between the reality of who they are and what they somehow represent to people. I think if Columbus came back today, he'd be astounded by his reputation and ubiquitousness in North America, partly because he never guessed North America existed. He never set foot in North America. There are some apocryphal stories about how he was in Key West or in St. Augustine, Florida, but it's not true. The closest he got was glimpsing some of the islands in the Florida Keys from the deck of his ship. Then he decided he was going too far north and headed south. So he never knew about this immense North American part of the continent. And as I said, the fascinating things about Columbus are all the mistakes he made, all his irrational and cruel and peculiar things that really make him so memorable, as opposed to his thoughtful, orderly, rational brother Bartholomew, who's been almost lost to history. Does that cover some of the voyages? Okay, great.
What do you think happened to him in that 2.5 years between his very, very, celebratory second voyage and his third voyage when he lost his marbles?
When he lost his marbles, it's hard to know. It's very hard to diagnose people over time, especially over 500 years. We do know that his health deteriorated. He complained of symptoms that are consistent with rheumatoid arthritis. He had various infections. Certainly his eyesight was badly affected. Going by his writing, he wrote down these hallucinations as clearly as any real incident or episode that he had written about earlier on. And I have to keep in mind that having hallucinations the way Columbus did was not, now would be taken as a sign of psychosis, perhaps, but in Columbus's day was not that unusual. And so I think what happened to him was that he deteriorated from the stress of these 4 voyages, and getting older. Columbus was 55 years old when he died, which was old for a sea captain, very old. So he was losing his faculties, and also felt that he really hadn't fulfilled his mission as he first outlined it, and also had a very tortured relationship with Ferdinand and Isabella, who at first endorsed him wholeheartedly and made him governor of all the lands he discovered. But later on, when they realized this was potentially a kingdom that was bigger than theirs, removed him from that office. And he was the wound to his vanity of this demotion was something that one can surmise he never really fully got over, and took more and more refuge in the religious order that he joined, and in wearing these manacles. There's a story about it which is true, which is, I think, revealing. When he was arrested at the end of his 3rd voyage for corruption in the island of Hispaniola, he was shackled and then sent back to Spain in shackles. He was supposed to take them off because they were there mostly for show, but Columbus, being Columbus, decided not to do that, and if it was going to be for show, he was going to show everybody that he was wearing them. So when he got back to Spain, he had himself paraded around wearing the monk's habit and the manacles, as if he were a religious penitent. Ferdinand and Isabella wanted to remove him from power, but they didn't want to actually make a spectacle of him and humiliate him in this public way. So this was a kind of a revenge of his in some way. And finally, they ordered his manacles to be struck off. But the story didn't end there, because he kept wearing the monk's habit, and he was buried with these manacles. They became an important symbol to him. So Columbus was a person of fascinating eccentricities, to put it mildly, and took his visionary role very, very seriously, even though he completely misunderstood what he had accomplished and some of the disastrous effects of that.
One quick question.
Yes.
You haven't mentioned the role of gold. Here's
Yes,
Cortez
yes.
in 1520.
I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Gold. Gold was really important. I kept talking about Columbus's religiosity, but his stated reason for going was to get gold and bring it back to Spain. Gold was extremely valuable, and Ferdinand and Isabella wanted it. Columbus thought that with his very literal approach to the Bible, he could sail and find King Solomon's mines, and so that he would find the mother of all gold mines, if you will. But of course he never did. What he instead found in the Caribbean, and especially in the Dominican Republic, was gold that had been washed down hillsides, and it was equivalent of panning for gold. So he and his men did manage to bring back some gold, and he was often talking about gold nuggets with great enthusiasm and great glee. Whenever he saw Indians wearing gold jewelry around their necks or in their noses or in their ears, he was always thrilled and brought as much back as possible of that. But he never did find a huge amount of gold. Interestingly, the Indians didn't regard gold as precious, particularly precious. It was somewhat precious, but they were happy to trade it for other things like fish hooks and mirrors and things like that, glass, because it was not the most valuable thing in their universe. So they let go of it pretty easily. And Ferdinand Isabella held him to account for not bringing back, the massive qualities of gold that he promised. But that was yet another miscalculation on his part.
Suppose you'd had a chance to give some advice to the king and queen.
Me?
You must have been thinking about that while you're writing the book. What could they have done that would have made this work out substantially better by whoever standards you want to choose?
That's a really good question. I don't know. Do you have an answer to that yourself? Or does anybody else have an answer? Advice to Ferdinand and Isabella about how to deal with Columbus? I think they sent him for a fairly straightforward commercial mission, which was to bring back gold and to bring back spices and to somehow extend the influence of the Spanish Empire, which they had just succeeded in unifying after the Inquisition. And it took a while for the strangeness of Columbus to dawn on them. And then when they finally realized it, they replaced him with other explorers and other administrators. But nobody really knew, neither Columbus nor Ferdinand Isabella, how to administer a Spanish colony. What was the point? What would it amount to? There was no thought, no theory about it that I came across in my research. And this was a lack that plagued not only Ferdinand and Isabella and all their ministers, but Columbus. For example, I just alluded to the fact that he was very unsuccessful on land, managing this colony. And of course, his skill set was to be a navigator, not a governor or administrator, even though that became his primary job. And imagine if it's a soldier who becomes a politician, and he might be a very, very good soldier, but not necessarily an effective politician. Well, Columbus was a disastrous politician, but there was nobody else who had any idea about what to do. Nobody else who went along on these voyages. They were all soldiers of fortune. They were going to the New World, as it came to be called, to get rich. Nobody else had an idea either, with the possible exception of some of the clergy who went. And the one who's the most memorable is Bartolome de las Casas, who's a voice who runs throughout my book and throughout this Columbus epic. He had sailed on some of the later voyages of Columbus. His father and uncle had sailed on the earlier voyages. He had originally gone as a soldier, but he had stayed in the New World. Eventually became a priest and was known as the priest to the Indians, and he saw it as his life's work to undo the damage that Columbus did to the image of Christianity. He wrote a massive 3 or 4 volume, depending on how it's published, history of Columbus's and the Spanish misadventures in the New World. He lived to be about 90 and spent his later years compiling this work. And then he distilled a short broadside out of it. The title tells the whole story, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies. So he was appalled by what Columbus and other Spaniards did in the name of Christianity. And as he wrote again and again and again, what kind of example is this of Christian compassion, Christian charity, Christian morality when the Spanish were enslaving or killing or in some ways, in other ways, abusing the Taino, in the name of Christianity. So he was trying to act as a corrective, but his words actually didn't really strike much of a chord in Spain. They did in Protestant countries, who were very quick to condemn the cruelty and the excesses of the Spanish, and eventually the torch of exploration, if you will, passed from Catholic countries like Spain to Protestant countries like England, partly as a reaction Not that they were models of humanitarian conduct either, but in terms of this rivalry, that's where Las Casas found an audience. You know, his moral. Well, he was accurate in his approach, but his perspective, which was so different from the others of his era, you know, found an audience a generation later.
First of all, I heard
Yes.
someone on NPR, was it you, a couple of weeks ago, was being interviewed on NPR. And one of the things they were saying was that Columbus made a deal with Ferdinand and Isabel to get a lot of the profits, like a large percentage.
Yes.
Was it you, or do you know about that?
Well, yes, that's true. And well, I've been on NPR talking about the show, about the book in the past few weeks. And
Okay.
he did make this. He had a contract with them.
Like
that-
10%, or was it 20?
Yeah, at least 10%.
Okay.
In his mind, probably even more.
Okay, I probably heard
And
you.
then how you define 10%, I think he felt that anything he discovered belonged to him. What he sent back to Spain, then perhaps 10%, only of that belonged to him. So there was a dispute about what that 10% actually meant.
The second question is, a lot of historians are saying that he was sort of the figure who's gone down in history, well, particularly with your explanation since the, beginning of the 20th century, as the guy who found it. But that there were a lot of maps that existed. He was using at least some maps that had a lot of good information
Yeah.
from previous trips. And then also, what about perhaps other people finding it first? Where do you stand on that?
He probably wasn't the first. There seems to be a lot of evidence that Vikings came before him.
Vikings were here, there's archaeological.
Yeah, and other, you don't mean Vikings, you mean other Europeans. Well, if the Portuguese, for example, came on a secret mission before Columbus, we don't know anything about it. And even if they came 10 times, nothing happened. In other words, nothing changed. Columbus's Four Voyages changed everything. Neither continent was ever the same again, either in terms of human history or natural history, because of the effects wrought by Columbus. I'll just cite one example, which has to do with horses. And for example, he brought horses with him on the second voyage, partly to use for labor and partly to scare away the Taino. Nowadays we think of American Indians as being inseparable from their horses, but there were no horses when Columbus first got here. And they transformed everything. They meant that Indians were able to roam far and wide, that their society became much more stratified, that they could be much more warlike if they wanted to. And they had an enormous effect. That's just one example of many things that Columbus brought with him. So that's just that's an idea, and of course of the germs that he brought. We've all heard about smallpox, measles, and things like that, which devastated the Indian population because they had no antibodies. That's one of those things we learned in school that turns out to actually still be true. Of course, Columbus didn't come with the intent of infecting the Indian population to decimate it. This was a very unfortunate, one of many unfortunate and unexpected outcomes of his voyages. So that's why Columbus is different from any other voyager or any other explorer who came before. No one else had an impact like that. Yes.
My question is a question for my grandchildren. Based upon what you have learned about Columbus, what should I teach my grandchildren on Columbus Day?
Oh, that's a really difficult question because, we want to honor ideals, but at the same time, we really can't deny the truth about Columbus and what he did and what he was like. And I just actually don't have a good answer that would be suitable for children about that because, he was a man of great courage, but in the service of, very questionable ideals. So I don't have an answer for you, to be honest.
I have more of a comment than a question. as I was reading the book, it became clear to me how damn lucky Columbus was. Trips back and forth, the wars, the battles. He was just a very lucky person, in addition to having
Right.
some skills.
Right.
It just
Yeah.
came out in the book.
Yeah.
All these circumstances
Yeah.
that might have gone one way or other when he was shipwrecked and he sent his friend to save him, and 8 months, 10 months later, he comes back and saves him.
Yeah, yeah, he did seem to have 9 lives. He had, you could look back and say he did have great survival skills that he had honed by living in the wilderness at sea, but also he was favored by fortune, that in fact his fleet wasn't destroyed by a sudden storm or squall or hurricane the way other fleets were, and at more or less the same time that he wasn't felled by illness in the middle of his life, that he managed to accomplish as much as he did. Part of it was just this incredible willpower, this sense of, this really extraordinary willpower that he had. And part of it was, I think, just, as you mentioned, plain luck, until finally, at the end, when his luck all ran out. And even then, he kept going and going. By that fourth voyage, he was sort of a dead man walking. He had no more backing from Ferdinand and Isabella. He was deluded, and yet he kept on voyaging. I've sometimes wondered if he had lived long enough to make one more voyage or 2 more voyages, what if his health had held up? What would they have been like? How irrational would he have been? And we just don't know. But I think that luck is partly the fact that he was so extraordinarily strong-minded, and part of it was just luck. So.
I said I had a lot of questions for you. Can you say something about the impact that printing and the invention of the printing press had on Columbus
Yes.
and his fame during
Yes.
his lifetime?
Sure. If Columbus had sailed 100 years earlier, we might not have heard much about him, because this would be before the invention of movable type in the West, and this was a very important part of Columbus's reputation spreading across Europe. He was, among other things, a terrific self-promoter. If he had sailed for Portugal, which was highly secretive, make an analogy to, say, the Soviets during the space race in the 60s, we might have heard little or nothing about him. We tend to hear more about voyages backed by the Spanish, even when the navigators were from other countries like Magellan or Columbus, because the Spanish allowed these voyages to be promoted. So at the end of the first voyage, for example, as soon as Columbus got, or even before he got in sight of land, he started writing a letter to Ferdinand and Isabella about his first voyage and boasting of all his accomplishments. Now, most of them were true. He embellished to a certain extent because he wanted to show that he had accomplished his mission, and he wrote more accounts like this. He wrote letters to various clergy with whom he was on cordial terms, also describing his accomplishments. And these were reproduced and printed and translated very quickly. They were translated into various languages, to French and to Latin especially, and they spread across Europe, and that gave Columbus the kind of authenticity in the sense that he was there first that other explorers didn't have. Some tried to copy him. For example, Amerigo Vespucci also wrote a pretty well-known account of his voyages to the New World shortly after Columbus, just a few years later. Actually, they overlapped. The only problem was 2 of those voyages never occurred. And it took a long, long time for historians to realize that Amerigo Vespucci had a very active imagination and was a semi-fraud. And why did he do this? He did this to glorify himself, to somehow, steal a march on Columbus. So the printing press could sometimes be a mixed blessing But in from Columbus's point of view, it really helped to spread his reputation across Europe very, very quickly. While we're talking about sources, maybe it's a little bit off the subject, maybe not. I talked about the multiplicity of sources and how wonderful, isn't it great? We can hear all these different voices talking about Columbus, but one side of the story we don't hear about, except by inference, is from the Tainos themselves, with whom he spent so much time. And all the accounts of their behavior and their dealings come from the Spanish. And we can gather a few things because some of the comments, especially the priests who lived with the Tainos intensively day after day for 2 years, for example, or 3 years through immersion, give some insight into their lives and motivations. But we don't have anything in their own words because it was a pre-literate culture. So there are no Taino records of the voyages or visits from Columbus or anyone else. And then this reminded me of perhaps even a larger, more metaphysical problem, and that was the difficulty of these two peoples understanding each other or imagining even who they were. I had talked earlier about the fact that the Taino were said to have considered Columbus a fulfillment of a messianic prophecy. We know what the Spanish thought of the Taino, which was, sort of interesting, sophisticated people who might be useful as slaves or might be helpful. They might be potential converts to Christianity, but in any case, they might be partners for procreation. But in any case, they were just kind of objects. They were tools of European visions or ideas of how they might be useful or fulfill their needs. But it's not just that they were talking past each other. They lived lives that were so different. We know from the priests who lived with the Taino that the Taino spent a lot of their time in repose. They were what anthropologists now call astral traveling. They smoked a very, very strong weed, which is no longer around, it's extinct, called cahoba, which would be roughly analogous to marijuana, but much, much stronger, and spent a lot of the time lying in hammocks. The Europeans had never seen hammocks before, and they use a device where they inhaled it into both nostrils. You can see pictures of these cahoba inhalers on the internet. I've seen them in museums in the Dominican Republic, and they're small devices. And that's how the men, anyway, spent most of their days. The women did most of the domestic work that had to be done. This was a much different approach to life, the afterlife, the spirit, and the physical world than the Spanish had. And there really wasn't that much of a meeting of the minds. So I've often wondered, it wasn't just that they didn't have a common language. I think their frames of reference were so different that, for me, it's sort of exceeded my ability to imagine what they actually really, thought of each other or how they related. To the extent they did relate to a certain extent, but in other ways they were very, very different. As I tried to suggest.
It must have been a feeding frenzy when they got the munchies.
When they got?
The munchies.
The munchies?
That's not my question. I wonder if you can address two things. Number one, funding for these trips.
Yes.
Who bought the boats? Who bought the ships? Where did the money come from? And did the people who funded this get what they expected in terms of a return on their investment, for lack of a better word? Number two, I wonder, for at least my own edification, it's a little bit off topic, if you can put Columbus's time and place in context with the so-called conquistadors who raped and pillaged Mexico, Central and South America.
Yeah. I can't really speak to Columbus and the conquistadors, but in terms of the funding I can speak to, it was funded by syndicates of bankers Ferdinand and Isabella were almost bankrupt, so it was mostly borrowed money to finance, especially the first voyage. Later on, they began to pay for themselves, and by the fourth voyage, Columbus himself had enough money to fund his own voyage, and so did some of the sailors who had sailed with him. But it wasn't that expensive because they weren't building some state-of-the-art, ships that were hugely expensive. They were leasing ships from their owners that had been in service for a number of years already for this voyage, which for leasing purposes was one more voyage that they would be taking. It's not the Mediterranean this time, but the ocean sea. The Nina and the Pinta and the Santa Maria were small vessels. They were 60 or 70 feet long, and they held about 90 people at most. They traveled with crews that were much smaller than that, so they were not particularly expensive. The hardest part of this equation to put together was the human capital, if you will, finding sailors who were willing to go. And for this, Columbus formed an alliance with the Pinzon family of Palos, Spain. Many of the sailors, commercial sailors in Spain, Columbus, of course, was from Genoa, lived in the city of Palos. And the Pinzons were influential there. And when they got Columbus's, when Columbus managed to get their loyalty and their backing by promising to cut them into a share of the proceeds and the glory, they were able to attract the necessary sailors to the voyage. But there's no question that the three ships, especially on the first voyage, sailed shorthanded. They had a difficult time, rounding up enough people. But the second voyage, it was completely the opposite situation. It was equivalent to a gold rush. Now, these were not trained, disciplined sailors. There was no Spanish Navy at that point. These were all soldiers of fortune, and they were going to get rich as fast as possible. And Columbus was disappointed because he realized he had brought along a bunch of fairly undisciplined Spaniards who expected to pick up giant gold nuggets on the beach, put them in their pockets or in sacks, and sail back to Spain a few weeks later. And of course, it wasn't that simple at all.
I have another money question.
Sure.
So, when the English got into this game in the 50s, I'd worked on Walter Raleigh, who's a kind of latter-day conquistador, and you hear a lot about the lust for gold and the expectation of picking up nuggets and so on. When I read a bit more about it, I saw that there were particular reasons why in the 50s the English state needed money, needed to support the currency. And you were just mentioning that Ferdinand and Isabella were nearly bankrupt. What had bankrupted them?
Well, they had completed this unification of Spain. The Inquisition had been dragging on for decades. They had confiscated the wealth, particularly of successful Jews in Spain, in order to give them some funding. The Spanish nobility owned the land. They had the land, but they didn't have much wealth, so they were desperate for some wealth and some political legitimacy and stability. So the only other source of legitimacy they had was from the Vatican. Rome gave them their blessing, and they were hoping that Columbus would, fulfill the other part of this. But it was a constant problem in Spain, and it only got worse under their successor, Charles, Charles V, Charles I, Charles IV. He also was constantly short of money for more or less the same reasons. Yes.
I thought that one of the reasons.
Can you come to the microphone?
I thought it was the reason that they were bankrupt, aside from all of that stuff, was the war with the Moors, kicking the Moors out.
The Inquisition.
Well,
yes.
I thought that.
Yeah.
Well, that's not the Inquisition. The Inquisition is.
Well, what I mean, driving the.
Okay.
But
I think the war against the Muslims was what really bankrupted them.
Yeah.
At least that's my understanding.
Yeah. Yes.
Other questions? Now, the question that I wanted to ask
Yes.
has really been sort of preempted, the sort of by the what do I teach my grandchildren about Columbus question. Because, I'm very interested in how we remember these people, why we remember them. You've written a book of such complexity and detail. You talked about how hard it is to keep all this stuff in mind.
Yeah.
And I think publicly, we decide to keep certain things in mind. We have national holidays and K through 12 education, and inevitably there's going to be simplification. And so, towards what should we simplify that memory? But you've already been asked that question, so I'm not going to ask it again, unless you want to take it up. So I'll ask something different. In the process of writing this book about this figure that in some ways seems very familiar, was there anything that surprised you that you didn't expect to find or that you changed your mind about in the process?
Oh, I think there were dozens of things, but I think one thing that jumps to mind right away is how mentally unstable and volatile Columbus was. I wasn't aware of his irrationality, of his hallucinations, of the fact that he could be so stubbornly in denial about the most obvious facts of reality. That was one thing that caught me very much by surprise and that I gradually came to grips with. Also, I guess the ratio of time that he spent in the New World trying to manage this colony, which was almost all the time, say 90% of his time, versus the time that he spent at sea, which was actually fairly brief. These crossings were 3.5 weeks long. With one exception, the 8 crossings were all quite short. And most of his time was spent trying to put down rebellions on the island of Hispaniola, grappling with administrative details, and not very effectively. So I had never thought about, or when I began this book, I didn't think I was going to be spending that much time on Columbus as administrator or governor or organizer of a colony, but that in fact, that's what happened, because a lot of his legacy, for better or for worse, mostly for worse, I guess, had to do with that. In terms of unfinished business with this book, if my editor and publisher had allowed me to write another 100 or 200 pages in this, I would have wanted to go into the Taino more. This is a really fascinating subject. There are lots of, I don't know how you describe it, partial, unconnected works about them. There's a lot to be said about them, about their language, about their culture. If you see them just through the lens of Columbus, that's one way of looking at the Taino, but there are other ways as well. By coincidence, in New York, where I live, there's a kind of revival of interest in the Taino, not just in terms of Columbus, but in general. But there are practically no Taino left. They're virtually extinct. So I became more and more interested in them, but you don't really feel their presence in a book. You have to go to the Dominican Republic and get some of the sense. But even there, you're not going to meet any because they don't exist anymore. But you do get perhaps somewhat closer to the ethos. So I wish I could have gone into them a little bit more, well, a lot more deeply than I did in the book. But it was mostly about Columbus was the subject. Yes. Yeah.
Is there any possibility Cervantes would have known about his hallucinations?
I don't know. I thought about Don Quixote and hallucinations in terms of Columbus and the idea of the windmill, tilting at windmills and all that. Especially when I thought of Columbus sailing uphill, north of Venezuela to the entrance to paradise. Seemed almost like something that Cervantes could have thought of, and of course Columbus was Italian, not Spanish. But I don't think there's a direct connection, but there seems to have been something in the ethos at that time. I mean, as I mentioned, Columbus wasn't the only one hearing the voice of God, he thought, or having those kinds of visions or hallucinations. It was not as unusual as it would seem to us today. And his brother Bartholomew, as far as we know, didn't, and we don't remember Bartholomew. So it's all these unusual things about Columbus that make him so memorable. At least, yes.
This is a personal question. I grew up in Haiti, and we celebrate the 5th of December every year has the discovery of the island. How accurate is this date? Do you know?
How the what?
How exact is the date of December 5th?
December. How does that tie into Columbus?
Well, that's the day we observe the discovery of Columbus of the island.
Oh, I see.
And
Well, Columbus is observed in a lot of different countries, almost everywhere in the southern hemisphere, except for Venezuela these days, and usually in October, but sometimes on different days, and under different names. Some places it's called Day of the Races, as in.
so the 5th of December is not.
I'm not sure what that date signifies, specifically, because in the United States everybody thinks of October 12th, which is the day of his first landfall on the first voyage. But that was not in Haiti. That was not in the.
Well, we think of it as the holy days. That's sort of sort of important day.
Yeah.
I wonder what the diary has for December 5th.
Well, we have to check it out. Also, keep in mind that he was following the Julian calendar, and we of course are using the Gregorian calendar, so we have to make adjustments for that of whatever it is, 10 or 11 days, just to add a further wrinkle. So actually, October 12th is really, according to the old style calendar, but we've always kept that. Yeah. So.
Okay, thank you, Laurence
Well,
Bergreen.
thank you very much. Thanks for those wonderful questions. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for your questions and comments. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks.
You've been listening to a program of Cambridge Forum, recorded in November 2011, co-sponsored by the First Parish in Cambridge, Unitarian Universalist, the Lowell Institute, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For a CD of this forum entitled Columbus, the Four Voyages, or for additional information about our ongoing radio series and our Forum Network webcasts, visit us on the web at cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Mary Fuller. Thanks for joining us.